All right. A couple cleanup things we got to do. The reception for Mr. Goldberg will not start till 5:15, so we have time to have this here for him. And I spent my whole life believing that the only sure things in life is death and taxes. But Loman Henry assures me that today there's three: death, taxes, and this forum is going to end at 5:15 sharp. So we'll go from there. But I'd like to welcome you to the panel discussion on how free market capitalism raises all boats. Personally, I do not care too much about boats, but I do care about people. It is my absolute and certain belief that free market capitalism raises all people. In its purest form, it provides an opportunity to every person to make his or her life better for themselves, for their community, for their state, and for their country. As we proceed through this forum today, if you have any questions, please write them on the paper provided, and we will get as many asked as possible. There are countless stories of individuals who, because of the free market capitalism system, were able to follow their dreams and overcome their fears. They started their own businesses. Many failed, some succeeded. But even in failure, there is a positive. An individual can learn as much from failure as success, and in many cases more. I would quickly like to share with you one such story. Many, many years ago, I convinced my wife to remortgage our home so that we could raise the necessary capital to allow us to start our first mining company. Through faith, hard work, and perseverance, it worked. The most predictable and gratifying trait of our employees was their drive. Many started working right out of high school for us. And eventually, some of their children also went to work for us. They started out as operators and laborers. But over time, they became heavy equipment operators, mine foremen, examiners, electricians, and many other positions that brought them more responsibility and more income. A few even started businesses of their own. I have no idea how many millions upon millions of dollars that these employees and companies paid in taxes. I have no clue how many homes, weddings, college educations were paid for, but most definitely, free market capitalism worked for all of us until, over time, more and more government regulations all but rendered it hopeless for a medium-sized mining company to survive. But it is a great, great system. Our first speaker today is Leo Knepper. Leo is the Executive Director of Citizens of Alliance of Pennsylvania, or formerly known as CAP. He is a lifelong Pennsylvania resident and longtime conservative activist. Leo will focus, well, I'll let you take what you want to talk about, okay?
Sounds good.
Here's Leo Knepper.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. It's definitely good to follow Mr. Smith, Tom, but it's a hard act to follow with Dr. Brooks. That was just really fantastic. It actually dovetails really well into what I wanted to focus on today. Basically, the question that I want you to try and think about is capitalism moral? Is it a moral system? Is free market capitalism a moral system? Dr. Brooks very clearly made the case that it is. It's a very moral system because it's fair. You are rewarded based upon the work that you put in. Rather than citing some facts and figures, I thought it might be a little bit more helpful to talk about the immorality of non-free markets. Just touch on that a little bit. Most people, when they think of capitalism, they actually think of the system that we have in America today. However, when you think about the level of government intervention in economic matters, everything from really large-scale interventions like the bailout of GM to smaller-scale interventions like economic development programs that we have, alternative energy portfolio standards where we actually force electric companies to buy more expensive forms of energy and sell it to you. It's not what most people would understand as a free market. It's pretty far from it. Although he was less well known than later political economists, I want to talk really quickly about a gentleman named Frederick Bastiat. He actually was basically the counterweight to the French socialists after the French Revolution in the 1800s, and probably one of the few French people that I actually like. He was not as well known as later political economists. He wasn't, hasn't gained as much popularity as, the Austrians, F.A. Hayek, and folks like that. But some of the things that he had to say are really kind of relevant to what we have going on today. So just bear with me a second. I'm gonna cite a little bit from his book called The Law. There's also another tendency that is common among people. When they can, they wish and live to prosper at the expense of others. This is no rash accusation, nor does it come from a gloomy and uncharitable spirit. The annals of history bear witness to the truth of it. The incessant wars, mass migrations, religious persecutions, universal slavery, dishonesty in commerce, and monopolies. This fatal desire has its origin in the very nature of man, in that universal and insuppressible instinct that impels him to satisfy his desires with the least possible pain. It follows that men will resort to plunder whenever plunder is easier than work. Thus, it is easy to understand how the law, instead of checking injustice, becomes the invincible weapon of injustice. It is easy to understand why the law is used by the legislator to destroy in varying degrees among the rest of the people their personal independence by slavery, their liberty by oppression, and their property by plunder. Bastiat goes on and talks about it. He coins a term called legal plunder. And see if this sounds a little bit familiar. According to him, legal plunder can be identified just by asking the question, if the law does this law take from some person what belongs to them and give it to another person who it doesn't belong to? See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what that citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. Think about that. Think about that in the context of General Motors bailout, in the context of even things like what we call economic development. You are taking money out of your pocket involuntarily and having it given to someone else. Under Bastiat's definition, that would very clearly be something called legal plunder. When we look at all of them share the characteristic of taking money from one group and giving it to another via the government. Furthermore, the money is not dispensed on the basis of the quality of a product or on the level of service that the provider creates. That money, your money, and our money is dispersed on a basis of who hires the better lobbyist or who knows the right people at the Department of Community and Economic Development. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the heart of the problem. The government at both the state and federal level have built so many barriers and made the businesses dependent on handouts that it has become easier to plunder than it is to work. How exactly do these programs make it better as Dr. Brooks mentioned for people to start businesses. How is it valuable for folks who are just trying to get their feet off the ground? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why there's a hole in the boat that's supposed to be rising in free market capitalism. It's because it's not a free market system anymore. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Representative Dave Reed. Dave represents the 62nd District, made up of parts of Indiana County. Representative Reed will be focusing on how to combat the socialization of the free markets.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you all for having me this afternoon. I especially want to thank Loman Henry for the invitation to join you all today. I want to thank Tom, a good friend and a tremendous 2012 U.S. Senate candidate, for moderating today's panel. I want to thank my fellow panelists for engaging in a discussion on free market capitalism in America and Pennsylvania. And I especially want to thank each and every one of you for being committed to the cause of moving Pennsylvania and the United States forward. As I looked at our topic, the free market and capitalism and raising all ships, I looked at the panelists and their various backgrounds, and I realized we would probably have a traditional discussion focused on the interaction between economic development and government and what that appropriate interaction is. And certainly there have been two basic philosophies on that interaction in America over the last couple years. You know, in Pennsylvania, we had Governor Rendell's philosophy, and in the United States, we had President Obama's philosophy, basically both a Keynesian view of economic development, where government knows best. Well, government knowing best basically got us higher deficits and higher unemployment rates. Then you have the opposing viewpoint, which I tend to abide by, which would be the free market approach, where you lower taxes and lower tax rates for all job creators, where you end corporate welfare and end tax loopholes so all businesses, no matter how small or how large, can succeed, or they can fail, but they can do so on their own merits. And third, you reduce government's role in economic growth to investing in infrastructure so that all citizens and all job creators have an equal opportunity at that asset. It worked very well during the years of President Kennedy in 1960 and President Reagan in the 1980s. And you have to question why today, given past success, do so many of our citizens still err towards the side of the Keynesian view of government knows best when it comes to economic development? And a better question is, how do we prevent the socialization of our free market given that tendency? The first thing we need to do is identify a key problem and dilemma going on in America today, a key issue that we in America are lacking definition to. We lack a vision, and we lack a real discussion on the issue of poverty. We lack results, and the public is incredibly frustrated with the lack of results on helping our neediest citizens. If you look at where we are in America, we're the wealthiest, most developed nation in the history of the free world. And here we are in the year 2014, and 46 million of our citizens live in poverty. And it's not because of a lack of effort. We spend almost $1 trillion a year between local, state, and federal efforts on anti-poverty programs. Even LBJ, who began his war on poverty in 1964, 50 years ago, would look at those results and say that we have failed. We failed our taxpayers, and we have failed our most needy citizens. So the question becomes, how do we do better? How do we in Pennsylvania do better? How do we in America do better? Well, the first step to doing better is to define the outcome, define success. Government all too often defines success in what I would deem the bodies in, bodies out approach to helping the impoverished citizen. Meaning, if you come in the door to a social program and you go back out, that is a successful program. We don't track how that program helps transform your life in the long run. We don't track whether you need to come back next month for the same exact problem. But if you come in and you go out, that's success. That is not success in the year 2014. Number two, we need real performance measurement standards to measure whether we are achieving those outcomes that we set forth. Number three, we need to hold the programs accountable using those performance measurement standards. And finally, we as elected leaders, we as policymakers, need to make decisions. They could be legislative, policy, regulatory, or in particularly budgetary decisions based upon results, based upon data, based upon outcomes, not based upon emotion. You see, government does a horrible, horrible job of ever reevaluating whether our programs work. It takes decades for an elected official to even ask, does a program work? Let alone asking, is there a better way? Luckily, the nonprofit sector is far ahead of the game. They're doing amazing things across Pennsylvania. Government needs to find a way to support those efforts. We need to find a way to replicate those efforts, because only when we do we get past this Keynesian view of economic development. Only when we do we get past class warfare and the discussion on income inequality. Because when we spend our limited resources, our taxpayer dollars in the most appropriate, effective, efficient manner possible to take care of our neediest citizens, to transform their lives from one of an impoverished home life to one of self-sustainability, then the free market will work for everybody. Then the question of what is and what is not an appropriate level of governmental intervention will go away. And then, from a governing perspective, we have the ability to give our citizens the greatest gift any government can give those in which they represent. And contrary to popular belief, that gift is not creating a program so that every single person can have dependence upon that program, but that gift is ensuring that each of our citizens can actually be economically and financially independent from their government. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dave. Our next speaker is Gwenne Alexander. She is the Executive Director of Action PA. She plans to focus on or talk on how the family fits into the picture, or actually, how the fragmentation of the family plays a large role. Gwenne?
Well, actually, I understand that Rick Santorum gave some similar information a little earlier this afternoon. So let me just confirm for you some of what you may have already heard. And this is so very important for us to get and understand. But let me start out by saying I have found the secret to financial success. And it's easy. I'll be glad to share it with you, but first we're going to give you a couple of facts, and then I also have some bad news. And the bad news is that there is a crisis in America today. America is at a crucial stage because this calamity involves kids and the poor and our American economy. I'm talking about the fragmentation of the family. And if we want to talk about the American economy, we have to talk about what has happened to the family. Think about the changes that have occurred in the American family in the last 50 years. The disintegration of the family has had a massive impact on our economy. Liberals have convinced many in our society that biblical standards are archaic. And unfortunately, they have made some great progress in their efforts to break down the American family, and in so doing, they have created more and more government dependency. Now, some facts. There has been a radical change in the growth of single motherhood. In 1930, the percentage of white, non-Hispanic single parents was around 2%, and today it is 30%. But an even larger change has been with black, non-Hispanic single parents, which went from 15% in 1930 to today over 70%. In 1900, the rate of single parenthood was about 5%, and in 1960, it was 12%. Today, more than half of all American children will end up living with a single parent at some point. So, how does that affect our economy? Let's look at 4 areas. Number 1, welfare. More than 90% of adult welfare recipients are single moms. Number 2, food stamps. You've heard the statistics. We have a record-breaking number of Americans that are on food stamps, over 50 million. A report from Cornell University said nearly half of American children will eat meals paid for by food stamps at some point during their childhood, and 25% of them will be on food stamps for 5 years or more. A Census Bureau report says 3 out of 4 mothers on food stamps also receive other welfare benefits. Number 3, in the area of health care. A report from Washington University in St. Louis says children in poverty are significantly more likely to experience a range of health programs, including low birth weight, lead poisoning, asthma, mental health disorder, delayed immunization, dental problems, and even accidental death. And number 4, in the area of prison. These statistics are really pretty gruesome. So if you are a child in a single-parent household, I say don't listen. And why? Because you can beat the odds. I'm just giving you the statistics, but here they are. 70% of juvenile inmates serving long-term prison sentences come from a single-parent household. As well, 72% of juvenile murderers and 60% of rapists. Also, 70% of teenage births, dropouts, suicides, runaways, juvenile delinquents, and child murderers involved kids from single-parent households. So, without going on and giving you more and more statistics, you can see that the breakdown of the traditional family is one of the most significant economic factors of our day. And also that big government does a lousy job in providing for care for the poor, especially in the area of single-parent households. So, okay, after all those statistics and bad news, maybe you're ready for the secret to financial success. Well, it is. Here it is. The secret to financial success is number 1, stay in school. Number 2, get married. And number 3, have children. In that order. That's the secret. You have to do it in the right order. Lastly, research shows 2 things. Number 1, that poor children whose parents stay married are twice as likely to move up to the middle class. And number 2, research proves that the intact family is the most powerful, most anti-poverty, pro-prosperity program ever created.
Thank you, Gwen. Our next speaker is State Senator Mike Folmer. Mike represents the 48th Senate District, which includes all of Lebanon County and portions of Berks, Chester, Dauphin, and Lancaster counties. Senator Folmer will talk about making Pennsylvania a right-to-work state, careers rather than jobs, and striving to make our Commonwealth a top competitor in job creation. Senator.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here today, and that's what we're going to talk about. Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. After World War I, ladies and gentlemen, Pennsylvania was the 3rd largest economy in the world. Only the United States and British economies were ahead of us. We are located within 100 million people in about an overnight's drive. That's 1/3 the population of the United States. Recently, I was at a town hall meeting in the city of Lebanon where I live, and I live in the north side. Matter of fact, the elementary school that's up over the hill from my home is about 85% Hispanic. I live in the oldest section of Lebanon and proud of it. But I was invited to a Hispanic church for a town hall meeting, and there was a young lady that stood up and asked me, she said, Senator Folmer, the welfare lines are getting longer. You're cutting back the services. What are you going to do about that? So I stood up and I said, well, ma'am, I said, first of all, thank you for being here this evening. But I said, let me ask you this question. I said, a government that's big enough to give you everything that you think that you want is definitely big enough to take away everything that you need. Do you really want to put your hope into an access card? And she sat back She sat back, and I began to go on. I said, why doesn't Pennsylvania have a Honda assembly plant? Why doesn't Pennsylvania have a Toyota assembly plant? Why did BMW go to South Carolina? Why is Michelin Tire in South Carolina? Why is Mercedes-Benz in Alabama? Why is Airbus Aeronautics in Alabama? I said, these are careers. These are not just jobs. Wouldn't you want your children and wouldn't you want for yourself an opportunity to have a career where you can be independent of government and not worry about government taking it away from you? Ladies and gentlemen, this is our fight. I was at in my last reelect, I was at a debate with my opponent, and the question was to the candidates, as a legislator, what's the best way you could help the working poor of Pennsylvania? My answer was very simple. I said, become a right-to-work state. Why? Because that creates opportunities. Folks, when we talk about raising minimum wage, when we talk about all these other issues, we are wallowing at the bottom. I mean, how high would you want to make minimum wage? Do you make it $10 an hour? Do you make it $20 an hour? Do you make it $30 an hour? That's not the issue. The issue is the fact that we need careers back in Pennsylvania. But see, that's not the only answer either. We have regulations that get in the way of our existing companies that stayed here in Pennsylvania. So we got to make sure that they stay here also. So the real question is this. If we really care, and I'm saying if we truly, really care about the poor, then why aren't we right to work? Seriously. It's not about right to work. Everybody has a right to work. I actually would like to call it freedom of workers. Freedom to have the opportunity to have a career. Imagine, I cannot imagine what BMW would do to my home county, Lebanon County. And they're going to be expanding. Michelin Tire, $750 million tire plant. But they're not here in PA. I want Pennsylvania great again. And we should be great again. BMW should have been in Pennsylvania because of our location. Airbus Aeronautics should have been in Pennsylvania. Honda and Toyota, I could go on and on, as I said. So the question is, do we in the legislature have that ability to do that? And I'll tell you, there's a bill that's going to be floating around. It's called Paycheck Protection. It's one in which is necessary. And folks, I grew up in a very blue-collar union I used to be a Teamster. I get that whole jargon. I really, really do. But I've seen through the lies. Because when you look at the states that are right to work, you're seeing their average salaries are higher than ours. And folks, what happens when people have extra money in their pockets? They spend it. What do we have to capture those dollars? We have various taxes. So we could increase our public sector revenues without one new tax and without increasing any existing taxes, but just by attracting real manufacturers back to this state again. And being right to work wouldn't cost us one penny, but it would take a willpower of the legislature to do that which is right. And let me close with this. You know, as we talk about free market and we talk about capitalism, we talk about those things, this nation was built on those very principles. And I spoke at an earlier class today with Cool on the Second Amendment, but I left them with this point, and I really want you to get this. For society, for a free society to continue to exist and go forward, we need to hold to three domains. Two of those domains are external domains. The domain of the law, which is our court system and our police force, and to take care of antisocial people, to make sure society is peaceful and keep the peace. The other domain, external domain, is the domain of freedom. The freedom for instance, the freedom of property, the freedom to think of an idea, the freedom to have an entrepreneurial spirit. But the third domain is the very important domain. Those two external domains are important, but the internal domain is this. doing that which is right simply because it's the right thing to do. And that's an internal domain. And for our society, to continue, we need to have legislators, and we need to develop a society. And I think she brought up a very good point about what's happening to our family and so forth, is that we are losing that eternal domain. And when we lose that eternal domain of doing that which is right simply because it is right, then that affects the two external domains. We start losing our freedoms because we think government has to pass laws to continue to protect us, and the laws and we fill up our prisons and so forth. So for us to move forward, I know it sounds simple, and it's just one finger on a list full of fingers that we should do in Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, to make it great again. But I do not understand why we are not a right-to-work state, because it would be the best thing for us, it would be the best thing for the people of Pennsylvania, it would be the best thing for the workers of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Our next speaker is Dr. William Ruger. Dr. Ruger is with the Charles Koch Institute. I'm allowed to say that here? Okay. Dr. Kruger co-wrote the book Freedom in the 50 States, and he will discuss how Pennsylvania stacks up. Doctor?
Well, thank you for having me here. And I got to tell you, given that I'm a former professor, it's a little bit dangerous to give me the podium. So, okay. But it's really exciting to be here in one of the states from Washington, D.C., because it's really in the states where we can do a lot for freedom while Washington dithers. So it's really exciting to see you here and motivated for the fight for freedom. Now, I'm going to talk about how Pennsylvania looks compared to other states in terms of freedom. And if you have the slides, thank you very much, you go to the next one. And then how it matters for prosperity. And I come to this as the author of the Freedom Index, which is the most comprehensive study and ranking of freedom in the 50 states that's currently available. And my co-author and I, Jason Sorens from Dartmouth College, we look at 3 key areas with over 200 total variables measured. And we look at fiscal policy. These are things like tax burden, government spending, government employment, and so on. Regulatory policy, which Pennsylvania knows a lot about, as we just heard. The liability system, things like land use regulations, labor regulations. And then also personal freedoms, things like gun control, educational freedom, tobacco regulations, and so forth. Now, this is the 3rd edition of the study, so we've been doing it for nearly 7 years now, and it's published by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, which has been a great home for the study. Slide. Now, the purpose of the study is to measure and compare the American states on how their public policies affect individual freedoms in the economic, social, and personal spheres. Now, freedom is valuable for its own sake. We all know that. It's just great to be free to live as you see fit. But it's also important because freedom has dynamic effects, and this study shows us and helps us investigate the relationship between freedom and all kinds of other things, things like economic growth and migration. And so it's useful for legislatures and businesses and scholars who want to examine data and look at how their states compare to others. Slide, please. So how does Pennsylvania do? How does Pennsylvania stack up? Well, one of the great things about our study, I think, is that it gives us data to look at, because we all have our own kind of intuitions about things, but really I'm a data-driven political scientist, and this helps us really look in particular to see in what areas the state is doing well on and what areas the state needs to improve. And so I'll give you some of these comparative rankings here in the various categories and then overall. So here you see fiscal policy, and you see the different variables that are included. And you see that South Dakota is the #1 state in the union when it comes to fiscal policy. It has relatively low tax burden, relatively low government spending. And you see Pennsylvania here is basically in the middle. And I think what's important about Pennsylvania is how it relates to its neighbors. And here, Pennsylvania does quite well compared to states like New York and New Jersey, Ohio. But it doesn't fare as well as half the rest of the union, so there is still room for improvement. Slide, please. In regulatory policy, Pennsylvania also is roughly in the middle here. And you see a few states over, Indiana is the #1 state in the union. And we just heard someone talk about right to work. And Indiana has been one of those states that has made great strides in the regulatory arena. And that's really going to help them grow in the future. And I'll talk about some of the data or scientific evidence behind that statement. Slide, please. So here's economic freedom, which is a addition of the fiscal and the regulatory policy. It makes up approximately 2/3 of the Freedom Index. And you see here again, as we might expect from what we saw earlier, that Pennsylvania is roughly in the middle, around 30th. And you see some of its neighbors doing quite poorly, although here you see where Delaware really breaks out from this neighborhood. Slide, please. In terms of personal freedoms, Pennsylvania is, in its neighborhood, roughly in the middle, and in the country, it does not fare so well. It's 35th in the country in terms of personal freedoms. And this shows you some of the problems with these arguments about blue states and red states, because it doesn't really map as well, as honestly as or as likely as some people see. Now, in terms of overall freedom, please slide. We see here that Pennsylvania is 31st, and some of its neighbors do quite poorly. New York is one of the worst in the country, or is the worst in the country, but also New Jersey at 48th, states like Maryland and West Virginia coming in the 40s. Slide. Here's a scatter plot. I wouldn't be a political scientist if I didn't do something like this here for you, but this just helps you show where Pennsylvania fits. It's roughly in that middle area where the 0 and the zeros connect. Next slide. So here you see one of the outcomes of freedom, which is that people are voting with their feet in this country, and we're seeing people leave states that are less free and moving to states that are more free. And these results hold even when we control for things like climate. So it's not just people moving to places that have warm weather like California, or beaches or mountains like California, or like Utah or Idaho. Instead, people are moving because of freedom. And Pennsylvania, because of its neighborhood, isn't faring as bad as we might think, given that it's in the bottom 40% of the country in terms of freedom. It's still not losing its population as much as states like New York, which lost 9% of its population from 2000 to 2011. Pennsylvania lost 0.3%. And that's largely because it's better than their neighbors. And that's one of the important things about our federal system, is that states can compete with each other. And so one of the great things Pennsylvania could do is to increase its freedom, particularly in the fiscal and regulatory realm, and that way outcompete its neighbors, attract those citizens and businesses, and really do a lot better for its citizens. And then lastly, the last slide, please, here. My time's running short. Adam Smith said that all we really need are peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. In other words, we need something like a free state. Well, the question is does economic freedom encourage economic growth as Smith thought it did? And the answer is yes from our data. Regulatory and fiscal policy are both positively associated with cost of living adjusted personal income growth. In other words, when you keep the regulations low, when you keep the taxes low and the spending low, you're going to grow and your citizens are going to prosper. And that's what I'm hoping the people in this room can achieve for Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Good. Okay. We've got several questions here, and I want to thank you folks for sending them up. Gwen, you're sitting right here. Why don't we give the first one to you? And it is, are you seeing people of faith in political life?
I guess I'm seeing a change in that. When we first began our organization's called Action of PA, and Action is an acronym for Americans for Christian Traditions in Our Nation. It seems to me that that Christians tend to be involved with, they all have a job, they all have their family, and they all have their church, and that really is enough. They don't need to add one more thing to their lives. But recently, I think that people are starting to pay attention, and they are realizing that Dr. Dobson, I'm not sure that I can quote him, but he says when Christians back away from the political process, it's just immoral people, basically, that want to take over. So I think I'm encouraged. I think Christians are starting to pay attention.
Thank you. Next question is to Mike Folmer. Mike, they're asking, what should we do to support right to work, especially if we have already contacted legislators?
Great question. Sometimes my cynicism comes out here. Moving forward. And it's kind of like this. Here we have a Republican executive branch, and we have a Republican legislature on both sides. And we can't get something that I believe would be very, very beneficial. I think what we need to do, to answer your question now, is that just keep on, and helping on the outside. We're trying to work it better on the inside, and trying to move things forward. As you know, look, I'm going to talk about the 800-pound gorilla in this room. Let's be fair. It's about the unions. I mean, let's really be honest. And we've allowed the over-influence, especially of our public sector unions, to influence our policies. And we have to, as a legislative body, stop worrying about our next election and start doing that which is right. Plain and simple.
This one's to Dave Reed. They're asking, how do we persuade those on the other side of the effectiveness of morality of the free market capitalist system?
I think that's probably more geared towards Leo's comments, but I'll answer the question. I think the biggest thing you can do to make any persuasion in the political arena or in the economic arena is you produce results. You produce results, you communicate those results, and you put together a case on how you can continue to improve upon those results in the future. And I mean, let's look at it from a very basic perspective. We all may be political junkies. We may all pay attention to what's going on at the national level or at the state level, but most folks are too involved with their daily lives, getting up, going to work, taking their son to a t-ball game or their daughter to a dance recital and putting food on their own family's table. What they really want to see from their elected officials, from their government, and from their economy is results. And I think the results that were gained, when President Kennedy, went with that movement in the early 1960s and President Reagan continued it on in the 1980s, speak for themselves. And the results of the Obama administration and the Rendell administration speak for themselves as well. We have record deficits and high unemployment rates. And I don't think that can possibly be any logical person's definition of success. So I think it's about producing results and about communicating a better path for us to take.
Leo, that was to Dave, but you want to take a crack at that one also?
Yeah, I actually, if I could go back to what Senator Folmer's question was about how we can move right to work forward and just the issue of the unions. One of the things that most people don't realize, and if you want to find out which members of the House and Senate, particularly which Republicans are standing in the way of advancing right to work, go to the Pennsylvania Department of State website. You can search for them and see how much money they're taking from the unions. See how much money Governor Corbett's campaign committee has taken from both public and private sector unions. See how much money the Senate Republican campaign committee has taken from public and private sector unions. And see how much money the House Republican campaign committee has taken from public and private sector unions. If you want to know why these issues aren't advancing, it's because the unions are outspending you by about a 10-to-1 basis. So while money isn't necessarily the answer, start asking your representative, hi, Representative, Smith, why are you taking money from these organizations that are opposed to the things that we want to see accomplished in Pennsylvania? Start holding them accountable. To give you an amazing example of this, In the House of Representatives, there's a gentleman from southeastern Pennsylvania, Representative Gene DiGirolamo, who runs a political action committee that's called Good Jobs PA. Good Jobs PA is entirely funded by unions and trial lawyers. He funnels that money to other Republicans who are squishy on labor issues. This is done completely out in the open, and there is nothing done about it within the Republican caucus. If you want to start moving these issues forward, we need to start addressing those kind of problems.
Thank you, Leo. There's a question here for Dr. Ruger. Is there a way to compare the migration stats with the welfare/entitlement draw to a state?
Well, we don't look at that question in our study, but what I would say to you is that the people who are moving most often are the people who are looking for those advantages that come with low tax, low spending, low regulatory states, because those are the places that have job growth. Those are the places that have a kind of robustness that you're seeing in many places, and so people are leaving, particularly young people. So we saw in our data that it wasn't just older folks that were retiring, say, from New York and other places in the Northeast to Florida, but actually a lot of millennials, those younger people. And one of the things that's terrible about that as a dad is that I want to live in a place where my kids have opportunities at home, that they don't need to move out of state when they might want to be near their family, because families and relationships are such a key part of societal and individual well-being. And we don't want to have our children have to seek out opportunities in other places. Let's have them seek it out at home, in our little villages, in our cities, and our towns right here in Pennsylvania for you or for me in Virginia.
Thank you. We're down to 2 minutes and 25 seconds. This one's to Mr. Folmer, Senator Folmer, and to Dave Reed. Why can't we get right to work and paycheck protection to the legislature now? Mike, you want to take it, and Dave, follow up?
It's union money, and the fear of losing the majority in the caucuses. And this is my question to my leadership: is this, and it reminds me of what Abraham Lincoln said to General McClellan. He said, "General, if you're not going to use the armies, can I borrow them for a while?" my point is that we have a real opportunity to do something really, really good, and I'm talking really, really good for the working poor of Pennsylvania, and we should get it done while we still have the Republican majority, because the status quo is not working, folks. The status quo is not working. And by doing nothing, we're just hurting our future, we're hurting our state, and we're hurting the citizens of Pennsylvania. I am convinced of it.
Well, I think certainly the easier of the two is paycheck protection, and really it comes down to basic mathematics. In order to accomplish anything with a democracy and in the state of Pennsylvania, you need three numbers to line up. You need 102 votes in the House, 26 votes in the Senate, and you need the governor to sign off on it. I think probably two of those three components are in place, and we're waiting for the Senate to get to 26.
Gwen, you're going to finish this up for us. Okay. Thank you both. Gwen, we only have a few seconds. Could you just finish us off in 15 seconds with your talk you gave? The question is, what can we as individuals do? Please, Gwen.
Okay, I'll try and do this quickly. You know what? Could I just go back to the paycheck protection and right to work? You know, I really I agree 100% with what Senator Folmer said, but you know, I think it has a lot to do with conservatives and what conservatives has done, and I realize that I'm talking to the choir right here. But you know, what can we do? All right, what can conservatives do? So I'll answer your question. What can be done? Sure. Maybe, I'm not really sure, but tax benefits for married people, be tough on absent fathers. I think the church gives us a big answer. The church gives you a connection to other families. They give you support. They give you encouragement. I did it quickly.
Thank you, Gwen. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank everybody. There was a ton of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but thank you. Have a great evening, and again, thank you.